years old. And he is, looks like your cute, typical, adorable, mischievous 4-year-old, and he was a real delight to get to know. The thing about Josh is he's not quite your typical 4-year-old, because he can tell you everything there is to know about the John Deere components, the hydraulic components of a John Deere tractor, which I know nothing about, so I'm not going to tell you anything about that this evening, don't worry. But Josh is diagnosed as a high-functioning individual with autism. And he lives in the state of California here in the U.S. And because of his diagnosis, he receives state support to support his learning needs. Now, the reason I came to meet Josh is because he gets evaluated regularly because of his state funding support. And on one such evaluation, he was evaluated on a standardized IQ test battery, and his IQ scores, his verbal and his nonverbal IQ scores, were found to be in the average levels for his age group. But however, his working memory scores were well below average. Now, the state looked at his IQ scores, his nonverbal IQ scores, his verbal IQ scores, and they said, since Josh appears to be performing in the average levels for his age, then he didn't really need any support for learning, because they reasoned that if his IQ was in the average range, then his learning should be in the average range for his age as well, and therefore he wouldn't really need any additional support for learning. Well, that's when his mom started looking more closely at his report and picked up on his working memory profile. And Josh's working memory profile, according to the report, put him at the bottom 5th percentile for his age. So if you imagine a line of 100 children, Josh would be towards the very end of that line. So Josh's mom was very concerned. She began doing her research in working memory, and she came across my work. So she got in touch with me, and she asked, and we started this email conversation about my research in working memory and learning, and she asked if I would be willing to look at Josh's working memory and assess his working memory performance. I did, and sure enough, I found that Josh's working memory performance was so poor, he was at the bottom end of the spectrum when it came to 4-year-old children. So Josh's mom decided that she wanted to take his case forward. She wanted to really be able to continue seeking funding for him. She had 2 older boys, or she has 2 older boys. Both her older sons are also diagnosed with ASD, autistic spectrum disorder, but the difficulty with them was that diagnosis came much later, so they really didn't have that support from early on. She had seen how much they were struggling, she knew what an uphill battle it was, and she did not want the same thing to happen to Josh. So she really wanted to do everything she could to keep the support that she knew that he needed for his learning. So we set up a time, and she asked if I would be willing to write a report on my research in working memory and education, and I did, and I submitted that together to her, and she submitted a whole packet of information, including my report on working memory, to a disability tribunal. So in the state of California, there's a judge that looks at all of these different reports and makes a decision based on individual needs. She then contacted me and said, would I be willing to testify via video link about my research on working memory and share a little bit about my findings of how working memory is linked to learning? I said, of course. And so we set up a time and put everything in place. Now, the day before I was due to speak, she sent me an email, and she said, the judge has reviewed all the documentation, all the reports, and has decided to make a decision. The judge looked at Josh's IQ scores. The judge looked at Josh's working memory scores, and the judge ruled that even though Josh's verbal and nonverbal IQ scores were in the average range, because his working memory scores were so far below average, he deserved to have his funding continued. He needed that additional support. Now, as a psychologist, I was just delighted to hear that the judge recognized how important working memory is for learning. And as a mother with 2 boys, one very close to 4 years of age, I was also so pleased to hear that Josh would continue to receive his support. I'm still in contact with his mom today, and it is a real delight for me to report that Josh is thriving and doing very well and enjoying learning very much. Now, I started this presentation with a story about Josh, but in some ways it's also a story about IQ and how we use our IQ scores. In fact, IQ was used in a large setting some 100 years ago for the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army at the time decided that they were having all these recruits coming in, and they wanted to have some way to be able to understand how to best allocate them into different stations. And they considered that IQ testing may be a good way to do that. So the president of the American Psychological Association at the time designed an IQ test to help the U.S. Army identify which recruits would be best suited for which station in the military. So I thought today it might be a little bit fun for us perhaps to have a look at some of these questions that the U.S. Army recruits would have taken some time ago. Here's one example. Again, this is from some 100 years ago. One of the questions a U.S. Army recruit would have had to answer was, Velvet Joe appears in advertisements of A, tooth powder, B, dry goods, C, tobacco, or D, soap. Now sometimes when I ask this question, I typically hear the response D, soap. Perhaps the name may lead you to think of feeling clean or sudsy, but actually the correct answer is C, tobacco. And the reason a U.S. recruit would know this answer is if they read a particular magazine which included those ads. And those magazines would typically be read by a particular income bracket of individuals. So this question would be easy for a very specific income group of the recruits, and probably as obscure to the rest of us, to the rest of the recruits, as it may be to us today as well. Now here's another question, again from the same IQ test given to the U.S. Army recruits. It is better to fight than to run because A, cowards are shot, B, it is more honorable, or C, if you run, you may get shot in the back. The correct answer here, and you may have guessed this already having looked at this, is B, it is more honorable. But here again you can see that this question taps very specific knowledge and specific experience and views about bravery, honor, and so on. Now, because as you can see the nature of the specificity of these kinds of questions, the U.S. Army was quickly realizing that this IQ test was not doing a very good job in allocating the recruits in the correct station. They found that this test was missing a lot of the recruits who were actually very good at higher stations. So the recruits may not be doing well on this IQ test, but really were well suited for higher levels in the Army. Conversely, there were some recruits who may have done very well on this test and therefore be assigned to higher levels in the military and yet be quite ill-suited for that position. They also found that college graduates would intentionally fail the IQ test because they did not want to be recruited into the Army. So they would intentionally answer these questions incorrectly so that their scores would appear to be poor and therefore not suitable for recruitment. So in light of all these problems, it took the U.S. Army just 6 months before they abandoned the use of IQ testing for their new recruits. Yet, over 100 years later, we still use IQ testing to help us identify our students' learning needs. And let's just take a moment to have a look at some of the questions to try to think if some of those questions are equally knowledge specific. So here we have the question, who is Queen Elizabeth I? Probably pretty easy for most British school children. You've got blocks where you have to mimic a shape, as you can see that they see a pattern, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this test. And finally, they have to give definitions of words, like for example, the word police. Now here, it may seem like this is quite general knowledge, maybe knowledge that most children should know rather than very specific knowledge, unlike the Velvet Joe question that we saw in the U.S. IQ test, the U.S. Army IQ test. Let me give you an example from a project that I had conducted using IQ testing with school children in the UK. I had given them a definition. I had asked them to give me definitions, rather, of the word police. And I was working in various school regions, in various LEAs. Again, they were all British school children. So in one group of schools, some of the children, they were 10-year-olds. They gave me lovely responses, things like, oh, police, they wear a uniform. You see them on the street. They help keep you safe. Now, I would think that for a 10-year-old, those are quite good responses. And sometimes when I ask adults to give me responses, I get responses such as, well, they maintain law and order, they prevent crime, and so on. So again, these young children's responses seem to mirror that aspect of safety. Every so often I get an adult who may give me a definition of the word police as a bad pop band from the 70s. But as funny as that is, it's not in the manual, so they wouldn't actually get a good score on that response. So here we are back to our British school children. I had one group of school children again that gave me great responses about how police wear uniforms and keep them safe. I then went to another group of schools, and I was testing the children there. Again, the same question. I asked them to give me a definition of the word police. Here, I received quite different responses. I would hear things like, I don't like police. They're bad. They took my dad away from me. Now, both of those school children's responses were drawn directly from their experience. On the one hand, they were children who had seen police on the street, maybe felt safe as a result of that. And on the other hand, there were other children who felt that those policemen were not figures that they enjoyed. Now, again, drawing directly from their experience, but only one response fit what the manual was looking for. So here we see very specific knowledge coming into play, that even with a simple word like police, this information or this knowledge is very specific and catering to a very set type of experiences. So we're seeing that, with IQ testing, it may not represent this kind of general knowledge that we hope that it's capturing. Now, working memory actually became of interest fairly recently in our recent history, certainly in psychology and in education, but it was some time ago that there was a man that brought this into attention to psychologists. And this man, it was actually a railroad worker. And he was, you may have heard the story before, and for those of you who haven't, I'll just spend a few minutes telling you about this story. He was a foreman in a railroad company, and he was busy leading his employees, and they were laying down tracks for railroad tracks. And part of that involved putting some blasting powder down in a rod, pressing it down or tamping it down, and laying the fuses so that they could lay the tracks down properly. Now, as part of the process, unfortunately, one of the fuses went off, and actually the rod that he was holding in his hand, this iron rod, went right through his eyes. You can see that in the image here, that his eye is closed. So that rod went right through his eye and through his brain. Now, if you've heard the story, you know that this man is Phineas Gage, and he is well known in psychology because he survived. After such an incredible accident like that, he fell immediately to the ground, but what was more remarkable was that he sat up, he was able to give his name, and he could even make his way home. And when the doctor saw him, he was sitting on a chair, and the doctor was so surprised to see that he could actually carry on a conversation. And so really this opened the door for psychologists, for scientists to try to understand what is going on in the brain after such a dramatic accident like this. And here you can see an image of the brain where some psychologists anticipate how the rod went right through his eye and through a part of the brain, the front of the brain, that we now call the prefrontal cortex. Now, why is this important for us today? Well, prefrontal cortex, as we now know, is the home of working memory. It's the part of the brain that helps us with our decision making. It helps us plan our day, manage our activities, decide which activities are distractors that we should ignore, decide which activities are priorities that we should focus on and target. And it's the prefrontal cortex of the working memory that is really critical to all of these everyday activities in adult life as well as in our school children. Now with Phineas Gage, his loss or this damage to his prefrontal cortex had serious consequences. Even though he survived, he found it very difficult to carry on his employment in the workplace. His direct supervisor said that he was a changed man. His temperament changed. He was no longer able to carry out his plans as he originally would have. He would make grand gestures, but never carry out any of his plans that he set out. So we can see again the role of the prefrontal cortex or working memory in making plans, being able to carry them out, being able to decide what to prioritize and what to ignore. And so we see Phineas Gage gave us real insight into the role of working memory as we know it today. Now I know I've been talking a little bit about working memory and some stories behind that, but I just want to take a moment and a little tangent, if you will, and tell you a little bit about myself. And I know Erin mentioned a little detail about me. I'm a psychologist. I did my PhD at the University of Edinburgh. I spent 13 years in the UK and had a chance to work with a number of different national organizations and really enjoyed my time there. And the image I have up there is the Wallace Monument, and that was the view from my office at Stirling University, where I was the director for the Center of Memory and Learning in the lifespan. So I had a wonderful view on the sunny days, so the days that I could actually look out the window and the clouds weren't obscuring my view, and I certainly enjoyed my time in Scotland very much. 2 years ago, our family moved to the U.S., and I've traded my view of the Wallace Monument to this view of the beach. We live very close to the beach and enjoy a lot of outdoor activities like surfing and wonderful sunny summer day activities. So I think it's a nice trade, and I just wanted to kind of show you a little bit about where I was and where I am currently. Now, what is working memory? I've often described working memory as our brain's post-it note. And a post-it note is a great way to capture a key feature of working memory, and that is there is a limited space that we have to remember information, and it is this place that we have to work with information. It is the memory that we use to work with information. So in the classroom, if a child has to remember a set of instructions while walking back to their desk and carry out those instructions, that involves working memory. It is beyond a simple repetition or recall of information. So here's a little example of how you may, excuse me, let me just backtrack here. If you want to do this at home or where you are, you're welcome to, but sometimes I do a little activity at this point. I try to say, if you have a piece of paper or a pen to hand, see if you can write the word Mississippi in backwards order. And I've already showed you that. If you wanted to check your S's and your P's in the word, there it is up there. It's not too difficult of a task, and most of you, I imagine, would be able to do that without much difficulty. Now, if I then ask you to try to write the word Kazakhstan in backwards order, that may take a little bit more effort, a little bit more time, and it may take you a little longer to try to think of how you may do that in backwards order. Now, I think that this illustrates quite well how we use working memory in learning, that in some cases with processing information, if we have some familiarity with that word, perhaps a word like Mississippi or Scotland, it's quite easy to work with that information because you already have that stored in your long-term knowledge. But if a word, excuse me, if in a word like, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what's just happened here. If in a word, there we go. Hopefully you're all looking at the same screen as I am on Kazakhstan. And here I wanted to illustrate that if the word is quite difficult, then the child may struggle, because then they have to use more working memory effort to try to remember that in backwards order. Now, another feature of working memory, as I mentioned already, it is that post-it note is in the front of the brain, as we saw with Phineas Gage, the prefrontal cortex right up there. And it's like a conductor. It manages information from all different parts of the brain. So it sits up there at the top, and it draws knowledge that we stored in various aspects. So, for example, one key aspect is it draws on our long-term knowledge. What I've put here is, hopefully that's come up, our library of information, a store, our knowledge of facts, of multiplication tables, of grammar, little scientific tidbits or historical facts that we've gathered over the years. And so when we're trying to have a conversation or we're trying to remember something in the class, our working memory works together with our long-term memory. That library brings that information forward, works with it to generate a suitable response. Let's look at another example. If we have to do some comprehension in the classroom, I've given a fairly easy question here. If they hear a sentence, the cat sat on the mat, where was the cat sitting? Then we see working memory work together with our language centers of the brain to pull out that necessary information, to think about what the words mean, and to answer that question appropriately. With math, we see a similar process. We know working memory is involved. It works together with the math centers of the brain. If we have to solve an algebraic equation, just like the one we see here, working memory pulls that knowledge, our automatized knowledge about addition, about multiplication, pulls that to a post-it note so we can solve that problem. What I'm going to do now for the next section of the talk is look a little bit at 3 key features of working memory. So I'd like to highlight 3 aspects of working memory features that I think are really important and relevant to education. And I've called them the 3 I's, as you can see: I, important, indifferent, and improvable. And I'll spend a little while explaining and expanding on each of these aspects. And where appropriate, I've put references to the research, and you're welcome to look on my website on tracyalloway.com to get further information or even a link to the abstract about the research articles I'm referring to. The first piece of research, the first feature of working memory that I'd like to highlight is that it is very important. Working memory is important to education. And the way in which I came to this was I was part of a government-funded project, one of the first projects I was involved with when it came to working memory. And we were interested in investigating reception-age children, kindergartners. We wanted to know, when they're first starting formal education, what role does working memory play? How does it compare with other key cognitive skills like IQ, like phonological awareness? How do we know what working memory is contributing to learning at this age? And so one of the things we did, we recruited children all across the UK. It was a British-based study. We recruited children all across the UK. We tested them on measures of working memory. We tested them on measures of IQ, on measures of phonological awareness. And we looked at school-based assessments of reading, writing, and math. And we wanted to find out which of these would predict, which of these would determine and tell us how successful these children would be in all these key areas of learning at the very start of education. And we found that working memory was playing an important role, that even after other key cognitive skills like IQ and phonological awareness were statistically accounted for, we found that the size of a child's post-it note, their working memory, was determining how well they could read, how well they could write their name, recognize letters, how well they could recognize shapes, identify numbers, and all these key fundamental concepts that they would need to know in kindergarten. So that was the first step that I was able to investigate, that working memory is important right at the very beginning of education, right at kindergarten. One of the things I had a chance to do was I had a chance to follow these students up over a 6-year period. So 6 years later, I tracked down a group of them, and again, I assessed them on their working memory. I assessed them on their IQ, and this time, I also gave them standardized tests of reading, spelling, and math, as you can see there. So when I talk about IQ, I'll just give a quick explanation here. I'm talking about a standardized test of IQ, and I'm referring to the nonverbal and the verbal scores in the IQ battery. And here, when I'm talking about standardized achievement, I'm referring to a standardized achievement test, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, or the WIAT, if some of you are familiar with that. And here are some of the subtests we were looking at: the reading, where they had to read words, spelling, and math, where they had to solve various math problems using addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Now here again, I found that 6 years later, working memory was still an important predictor of learning. It was determining how well these children would perform 6 years later. So we see this pattern holding true, that working memory is very important to learning from kindergarten, 6 years later, and more recently we've looked at a college-age population and found that working memory was also predicting their reading success in a college-age population. So we see this growing body of research across the educational system of the important role working memory plays. Now, working memory too, I've had a chance to look at both ends of the spectrum. I've had a chance to look at students who are gifted and students who may have learning difficulties, and I'll come to that in a moment. But here, let me just take a moment to talk about my research with the National Association of Gifted Children. We had a chance to recruit a number of students from them, and as you know, they were classified as gifted, and their verbal IQ scores met that criteria as well. So they were highly gifted individuals, and what we wanted to find out is whether there would be a relationship between IQ scores and working memory when it came to this very unique population at the top end of the scale. So one thought might be that if IQ and working memory are similar and measuring similar skills, similar cognitive skills, then if one is high, so would the other. You would imagine that they both would kind of match that same levels. So here was a perfect opportunity for me to investigate that issue. I had a group of individuals with high IQ, and I could investigate their working memory to see if likewise they would also have high working memory. Now here, as you can see, I put the reference down there, I found that of the children we were looking at, all of them gifted students, we found that although they all had high IQ, not all of them had high working memory. In fact, we saw this huge range in working memory abilities. Some were high in their working memory scores, some were average, and some were even below average. So you saw this distribution of ability when it came to working memory. Now, why could that be? One possibility, one explanation is that the verbal IQ scores especially typically measure what you know. If you think back on, way back in that US Army IQ test, it measures a very specific knowledge. And even in our IQ test today, we're looking at very specific knowledge. Do you know your monarchs? Do you know who Queen Elizabeth is? Do you know your definitions? Can you actually explain what a policeman is? So we're measuring specific knowledge with an IQ, with a verbal IQ test. In contrast with working memory, we're typically measuring what you do with what you know. How do you use that knowledge? And if you think back of that slide I showed you with the brain and the post-it note, working memory is working with knowledge from different aspects of the brain. So it's what you're doing with your language knowledge, with your math knowledge, with this library, this store of knowledge in your long-term memory. So we do see a bit of difference in what verbal IQ scores are measuring and what working memory measures. Now let's look at the other end with learning difficulties here. Now I've put a little diagram up, and you can see that we've got various different disorders, and I've just picked a few of them that are common in our classrooms. We've got autistic spectrum disorder, ADHD, reading and math disabilities, and dyspraxia or motor difficulties, or some of you may know it as developmental coordination disorder. Now we know that each of these disorders have their own core deficit, their own core impairment. So ADHD students have a difficulty with inhibiting their behavior or their actions, their thoughts. Those with reading or math disabilities have unique difficulties with reading and math respectively. What I'd like to suggest is, in addition to their core problems, they also have some aspect of working memory difficulty. And their core deficit plus their working memory deficit tends to have an additive effect on their learning outcomes. So let me give you an analogy. Let's say that you hurt your thumb. You sprained your thumb and it hurts and it's quite painful and you can't really move it very well. But now on top of that, you were doing some gardening and now you have a splinter stuck in your thumb. So now you have two sources of pain, the sprain and the splinter. So this is similar to what it's like for students with learning difficulties. They have their own core deficit, but oftentimes they also have an additional difficulty when it comes to their working memory. They have this poor working memory, and together the combination of these two difficulties can make it very difficult for them when it comes to learning. And I will spend a little bit of time looking at dyslexia given our, our context of the conference with the BDA and so on. But if you do have questions about these other disorders, do feel free to raise them in the Q&A time. I'm happy to respond to them. I have published research in all of these different areas. The second I that I'd like to talk about is indifferent. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So we had the first I, working memory is important for learning. The second I, working memory, is indifferent. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't matter where you come from. Your socioeconomic background, your financial background doesn't matter so much when it comes to working memory. And I would like just to talk about a couple pieces of research to explain this point. One of this was done by some colleagues of mine in South America. They were looking at children. I think they were quite young children, 6 and 7 years old, and they were looking at children from different financial backgrounds. So this isn't my house hunting portfolio here in the US. These were children from different backgrounds, and they a good income background and a lower income background. And what my colleagues wanted to do was investigate whether there would be any difference when it came to working memory scores, when it came to other tests like vocabulary as well. So something that measures your knowledge versus working memory, that measures a bit more of what you're doing with that knowledge. And what they found was when it came to the vocabulary tests, there were big differences between these two income groups. As you could expect, one of the groups performed significantly better when it came to vocabulary than the other group. When it came to working memory, however, there was actually very little difference in their performance. And again, this idea that working memory seems to be measuring what you know and is not very sensitive to your financial background, certainly with younger age children like the ones in their study here. Now in my own research, I published work looking at other indices of socioeconomic background like mother's educational level, and found, and that's a good index for financial background or socioeconomic status, and I found that a mother's educational level was not related to a child's working memory. So in other words, whether the mother left school halfway through secondary education without completing her A-levels, or whether she went on to get a college degree or higher, that did not impact her child's working memory. I think that's very hopeful actually, because again, this idea that working memory is measuring our ability to learn, what we can do with our knowledge. It's not measuring what we know. Another study here that's currently under review was looking at a large database, and we were looking at children. This was using a British classification system looking at postcodes. And so looking at the postcodes, this classification used in the UK classified children as high income or low income, and we were able to look at these two groups and compare them. And we found, again, that there was no difference when it came to working memory scores between the high income and the underprivileged children. But when it came to other measures like IQ and phonological awareness tests, there were big differences between the groups. So again, your environment can affect the knowledge that you learn and the amount of knowledge you acquire, but when it comes to working memory and how you use that knowledge, working memory isn't different. Your environment does not affect your potential to learn. So for me, as an educator, I was certainly, it gave me a lot of hope to see that we, the nature of working memory and its links to the fact that it is different to the income background of parents. The other aspect in which I found that working memory isn't different is when it comes to learning styles. Now, some of you may be familiar with learning styles, and I often get asked this question when I speak. You may be familiar with this classification between verbalizers and visualizers. So students who prefer information in a verbal fashion versus students who prefer information presented visually to them. You also have the distinction between holistic learners versus the analytic learners. So those who like to see the forest compared to those who like to focus on the trees. Now, I did a study with a secondary school in the UK. We had, I think, a couple hundred students participating, and we wanted to investigate this question. Would learning styles make a difference when it came to predicting their key stage 3 outcomes, their learning outcomes, and so on, their teacher-based assessments, and how does that relate to working memory? Now, what I found was very interesting. What I found that if a student has high working memory, it didn't matter if they were verbalizers or visualizers. It didn't matter if they preferred the holistic learning style versus an analytic learning style. They were still able to be successful in all those key stage 3 outcomes, all those learning outcomes from English, math, and science to history and art and music. So again, if your post-it note, if your working memory ability is good, you're able to be adaptable, you're able to learn regardless of your preference in your learning style. Your working memory can adapt and you can still achieve well on all of these different learning outcome measures. So again, good news, I think, regardless of your learning style, if you have good working memory, you're able to be successful. So I thought we could take a moment here, and I thought I'd throw up a couple of case studies, a few case studies, and just have a moment maybe to talk about them, look at them, and think about how working memory may come to play in a classroom setting. So we've done our 2 I's already. We have one more to go, and I'll pick up on that after these little case studies. So we've said that working memory is important for education. We've said that working memory also is indifferent to things like our financial background as well as our preferential learning style. So let's have a look at Adam, who's 12 years old. His teacher views him as a problem student. He's often restless and fidgety and has broken classroom equipment on several occasions. His work is of a low average standard, with its quality varying considerably from day to day. His teacher is not sure whether he will reach national average levels in assessments, although she feels sure he has the abilities to do so. So my question here is, do you think that Adam has working memory difficulties? And if you do, what kind of clues are you looking at to help you reach that conclusion? So I'll leave this up, and obviously given that we're all seated in our respective homes and offices, I'll go ahead and talk through some of the features here. Let's look at Adam's behavior first of all. You can see that his behavior indicates that he's restless, he's fidgety, and he has broken classroom equipment. So the question is he doing it intentionally? Is he doing it because he wants attention? He's maybe having some difficulty in the home life and is acting out in the classroom? Or is he doing it because perhaps the classroom equipment is not suitable for him? It's too difficult for him to handle. He may be struggling with it. He may be frustrated as a result, and it ends up breaking. So we have a couple possibilities. That's not, we don't know the answer just based on the information we have. We have either his behavior could be driven by intentionality, in which case we may want to investigate further, or it could be driven because it is accidental and stemming from frustration and the fact that the equipment may be too difficult. Now let's look at the cognitive features of Adam. His work is of a low average standard, but the teacher thinks that he can achieve. So the question arises, why isn't Adam achieving? What's holding him back? Is it that he feels frustrated? Has he put up a mental block? Does he have the ability because some of the knowledge is automatized, like we looked at when we did the example of writing the words Mississippi and Kazakhstan in backwards order? Is some of the knowledge easier for him and so his working memory can work with that quite easily? Or is some of the knowledge less automatized and so it's more effortful for his working memory, and so therefore you see this discrepancies and differentiation in his performance? So again, some issues to consider as we look at Adam. I'll give us one more and then I'll keep moving on. Here we have George, who's 16 years old. He's well behaved and popular. His IQ is in the normal range. However, his academic performance is poor in all areas, and he's in the lowest ability group in literacy. He often becomes frustrated by difficulties that he experiences, especially in writing. He does not usually participate in class discussions and forgets what he wants to say even after he's raised his hand. So here we see George is showing a lot of the symptoms we associate with poor working memory. The fact that his academic performance is poor, he's in the lowest ability group, and his behavior, he's frustrated, especially in writing. Writing involves a lot of working memory. You have to keep a number of components in mind. We see that he chooses not to participate in class discussions, and his working memory lets him down. So even though he wants to try to participate by raising his hand, he forgets what he wants to say. So that's a kind of textbook case study of a student with working memory, and you may recognize some features of students with dyslexia on top of that as well, particularly when it comes to the literacy and the language. The last case study that I'd like to show is Olivia, who's 7 years old. She's outgoing, she's well liked by her classmate, and her IQ is in the high average range. We see that she has a mature and responsible attitude, and she's often chosen by her teacher to run errands. She's in the high ability group in both literacy and numeracy, and she often helps out less able children within the group, occasionally misguiding them. At times, she is forgetful and appears to be distracted from work. The teacher often asks her to help organize classroom activities, such as putting out art materials. Now here we can look at Olivia's behavior. We see sometimes she's distracted, forgetful. We could suggest that, well, she's 7. It's a typical 7-year-old behavior, not necessarily any signs that we should be concerned about. We do also see she's misguiding some of her peers. I've had some suggestions that, maybe she's just overworked. Maybe we're giving Olivia too many things to do. So like all of us, she's just got too much on her plate. And as a result, she may be misguiding some of her peers. Another response I've heard, maybe a little bit more cynical, is she wants to be number 1 in the class, so she may just give out the wrong information. So, but nonetheless, we see that her behavior with Olivia is really nothing that we should be concerned about. It's pretty typical for a 7-year-old. We do also see, now if we look at her cognitive profile, she is in the high ability group, and she must have a good enough working memory to be able to run all these errands. So she's clearly able to keep all of these things in mind, work with the information, and carry it out. So Olivia, we can suggest, is a child with average, if not high average or above average working memory to be able to manage all the different activities. So I hope it was helpful having a few different case studies to kind of place how working memory might look like in one of your students, and hopefully that might have triggered a student or an individual that may come to mind, someone that you have worked with, that you may recognize some of these features in them as well. Now I have another question for you. How big is your Post-it note? So a little quiz, we can do this all together. Let's try this. Oranges live in water. True or false? Lions have 4 legs. True or false? Now those weren't quick questions. Hopefully you were able to answer those pretty easily. Now do you remember the last words from each of those questions? If you could remember both of them in the correct order, congratulate yourself. You have the working memory of an average 5-year-old. Now what I've done here is I've put a little chart up here, and I've used the sun. I live in Florida. Florida is a sunshine state, so I thought I'd use the little sunshine here. And I've used the sun to indicate a piece of information. So you can see the average 5-year-old can typically remember and process or work with 2 pieces of information. That could be 2 words. It could be 2 numbers. It can also be 2 instructions. So we see that if you have a 5-year-old in your class, that's what they can do on average. Now, I was speaking to some educators, and a teacher came up to me at the end, and she teaches kindergartners, reception-age children, and she said to me, now I know why my class never listens to me. I always ask them to do 3 or 4 things at a time. And I can see now that this goes beyond what the average 5-year-old can remember. So something to keep in mind when you're working with students at different ages. Now, the average 10-year-old, you can see, can remember and work with about 4 pieces of information. In our teens and even in our 20s and our 30s, we're at our peak. We're remembering a huge amount of information, up to 6. In our 70s, we start to look like an average 7 or 8-year-old again, but I won't talk about that aspect today. Now, this is database in a few thousand individuals, and as I said, I've just illustrated that with these little suns today. Now here, we talked about this briefly. We do see that working memory is linked into long-term memory. So we do see that it's a two-way street, that on the one hand, we use working memory to take new information and transfer it to a long-term memory, but we also use our long-term knowledge to help us when we're working with new information. So to give you an example, when my oldest son was learning to write his name, it starts with the letter M, it was a working memory heavy task. He had to use his working memory when he was learning to write, go up the hill, down the hill, up the hill, down the hill for the letter M. But soon that became automatized, and now that's part of his long-term memory, his library of knowledge. Now, when his younger brother was born, he had to, his brother's name also starts with the letter M, and so, but this time he had to use his long-term memory, think of how the letter M is, and bring it up in his working memory post-it note to write his brother's name. So it's kind of, it's a two-way street. Our working memory works with our long-term knowledge, and our long-term knowledge can support our working memory. Now, the problem arises in the classroom when a child may not have that sufficient knowledge to work with information, or sufficient knowledge in their library, excuse me. So as you can see here, their library may be smaller. So for example, they may not have memorized the alphabet. They may not make that association between the sounds and the letters, whereas the rest of their classmates have. So compared to their classmates, they may have a smaller library. And as a result, that can affect their learning. So that's one issue. The other issue that we can have is that their post-it note or their working memory may be smaller as well. So on the one hand, they may not have that knowledge automatized like it should be. And on the other hand, they may have a smaller post-it note, so they can't work with that information with that flexibility and adaptiveness that they would need to compared to their peers in their classroom. So we have two problems that we need to look at when we're investigating learning needs in our students. On the one hand, their library of knowledge, and on the other hand, their post-it note size, their working memory size. Now, how can we measure working memory? Put here, obviously, we can look at brain scans, but I'm going to talk about these two measures today, a behavior checklist and a cognitive measure of working memory. Now, there are cognitive tests, so if you're an educational psychologist or an SLP, you're probably familiar with various different standardized assessments that do include a working memory component, like the WISC, the Stanford-Binet, the Woodcock-Johnson are probably less commonly used in the UK. The WISC may be something that you're more familiar with, and as you know, they do include a working memory index. One example is DigitSpan. The trouble is that it conflates forward and backward knowledge in that single area. So you're not the standard score that you get combines short-term memory, with working memory, and that score may be artificially inflated as a result. Now, there are some limitations too. One is that these standardized tests that do have a working memory component don't have any visual working memory tests. And that's really important because in my own research and in other research labs, we see that different learning needs may have differential profiles when it comes to auditory or verbal working memory and visual-spatial working memory. So it's important to know the strengths and the difficulties of a student's working memory profile, which we don't get in these assessments. Also in practice, a lot of these assessments are restricted to training, and so they're restricted to EPs and can make it difficult for a classroom teacher to be able to identify quickly and accurately what the working memory profile is of a student. So to meet that need, some years ago, I developed the automated working memory assessment, and the ALMA 2 was recently released. The listening recall, excuse me, the processing letter recall here, I'll just give you a sample of the test. They hear a letter, and then they see a letter, and then they have to remember the letter that they heard. So there's that processing part. Is this the same letter as the one they heard? And they have to remember the letter that they heard in the order that they heard them. So it goes up to 9 letters, and the program is adaptive, so it stops if it's too difficult, and so on. There's your spatial working memory test. It's the Mr. X test. They see 2 figures, and they have to determine whether Mr. Blue here is holding the ball in the same hand as Mr. Red. That's the processing part, and then they have to remember the location of Mr. Blue's ball. Again, it has to be in the correct order, and it goes up to 9 locations, but again, this test will discontinue if it becomes too challenging for the individual. Now let's have a look at classroom behavior. What if you want a checklist and you want to have a look at the student's behavior and make a decision based on that? Well, together with some colleagues, we created a working memory rating scale, also published by Pearson. There are 20 items, and here's an example of one of those items. Abandons activities before completion. And the teacher will just rate that child's behavior on how frequently that behavior is evidenced in the classroom. And the lookup table is very easy. It's color-coded, so if that score falls in the red zone, you know that that child is displaying behaviors that are associated with poor working memory. If the score falls in the green zone for their age, then they are fine. Those behaviors are not associated with poor working memory. So it's very easy to use, and they are, there's data published on the reliability of both of these tests here, and those are available on the Pearson website, as well as my own website that I mentioned earlier. There are links to all those research articles. Now, we talked about the 2 I's. One was important, one was indifferent, and the third I is improvable. Now, can we improve working memory from this? And that was my son when he was about 2.5 years old. He spent a summer with grandparents and enjoying the sunshine, so you can see he's having a good time there. So can we improve working memory from that to this? And I want to quickly add that that's not my son there, but use to illustrate the point how malleable or improvable is working memory. Now, before we answer that question, let's have a quick look at the working memory profile of a student with reading or language difficulties or with dyslexia. What we can see is I've put here verbal working memory and visual working memory. And if you remember, this task here was the letter recall test. And if you can recall, this is the visual working memory test, the next task. And you notice that I put this a little smaller, and I've done that intentionally because typically students with reading difficulties have a poor verbal working memory score compared to visual working memory. So you can see the strengths versus difficulties in working memory right here when it comes to students with reading difficulties. So that's one benefit of being able to identify both aspects of working memory. Now, when I've done some research looking at students with language difficulties, and one question was, which of these student has language problems and they have working memory problems, how can we disentangle this to see which is linked into their learning problems in the classroom? So to investigate this issue a little further, I had 2 groups of students. Both had low working memory. One of the groups had language impairments, and the other group had normal language skills. So this way I could have a close look at this issue. If language is linked into learning difficulties, then those with normal language scores should have higher learning scores than the group with language impairments. However, if working memory was the one driving their learning difficulties, then both groups would have low learning scores. And that's exactly what we found. We found that both of the groups had low scores in standardized measures of reading and math. So in other words, any advantage the group with the normal language skills had did not transfer to standardized tests of reading and math. If they had poor working memory, that was enough to jeopardize their learning success. it didn't give them an advantage if they also had good language. That language wasn't able to act as kind of a booster when it came to learning. Now, one aspect here, I'll just take a few minutes here and have a look at how we can, what kinds of difficulties they may have and how we can support that. So again, you remember we said that these students with learning problems can have one of two problems, one of two difficulties. One, they don't have that library, that big store of knowledge automatized like they should, or they could have a Post-it note that's not working as efficiently as it should compared to their peers. So the first we can see, if their library isn't there, if they don't have this information automatized, if they don't have that letter sound correspondence automatized, the word endings automatized, it can require a lot of verbal effort. And as a result, they can have difficulty sequencing information and instructions. So some examples in the classroom include if they have to remember long sequences of numbers that are arbitrary or unrelated words, like you can see here. Or this was an example from a classroom we were working with in the UK. To blow up Parliament, Guy Fawkes had 36 barrels of gunpowder. Now this involved a lot of working memory processing. They had to work with a lot of this information. It was quite complex. And invariably the child with poor working memory was not able to recall that sentence. Also long instructions. Here again was from another classroom we were working with in the UK. Put your sheets on the green table, arrow cards in the packet, put your pencil away, and come and sit on the carpet. So here we see that the children with poor working memory, they put their sheets on the green table and they were the first ones on the carpet. But that's because they hadn't done any of these other steps in the middle. That had kind of dropped out of their Post-it note. It was too much information for them to manipulate and work with. So what can we do to support them? Well, we can break down that information. If we can give it to them in smaller chunks or smaller steps, that can really help them. We can also create routines, and that can help build up their library, that store. If something is automatized, then it's already in their library and they don't have to draw on their working memory, their Post-it note, and use that effort to process that information. They can already remember the routine and carry out what they need to do. Or another option is to support them is to create a learning assistant help them, or even a buddy, especially at the start of school when they may be still learning the ropes, figuring out what they need to do, creating routines and having support, either a student in the classroom or a learning assistant can be really useful right now to build up that library for them so that they're not falling behind later on. Now let's have a look at students with dyslexia. How does that work with your library? Well, we talked a little bit about this. First of all, it can take them longer to connect letters with sounds because that's not automatized. So as a result, that will display itself as a difficulty. They can also mix up long words. Again, some of the awareness or the phonological awareness is not automatized, and that can make it difficult when they encounter a longer, more complicated word. Now, the difficulty too is that their working memory, when they try to recall information, they don't think to be cumulative in their recall. By that, if you've given them 2 instructions and say to them, please repeat these instructions so you don't forget, they may just repeat the second instruction, and it doesn't occur to them to repeat both of them in a cumulative fashion so that they can remember which is first and which is second. So something to keep in mind is that you need to kind of encourage them to do that. Also, their articulation rate may be slower, so they take a longer time to say that information, and you have this tip of the tongue phenomenon when they're trying to talk. So what can the teacher do there? One tip is to speak slowly or even repeat instructions. Or I've actually worked with schools where they've used a product called Talking Tins, and that may be something you do in your classrooms or your learning centers as well, where they're able to record the information. It's a very simple recording device, and the child can take it back. It's a huge button. They press the button, and they can hear that information back as they're sitting at their desk, without the teacher having to keep track of where they are. They're able to be self-sufficient in monitoring that. Now, kids under 7, children under 7, tend not to rehearse information. So one tip is to ensure that that's something they're familiar with doing, that you encourage them to do that, or even to say that information aloud. We talked about the working memory aspect, that it can be very effortful for them if they have poor working memory. And here's one way in which it can manifest itself. This was an example from a classroom that we were working with. So the teacher had written the day of the week on the board and then the activity just below that. The student with poor working memory conflated those two pieces of information. So she started writing, MON for Monday, and then joined up KET for the market. So it was just too difficult for her to keep track of all that information because her Post-it note wasn't big enough, and she ended up joining all of that together. So that you may see that as a common feature in some of your students with poor working memory in your classroom. What can we do? We can make the language more simple for them so they don't have to burden their working memory so much. So here we've got that same sentence example we saw earlier. To blow up Parliament, Guy Fawkes used 36 barrels of gunpowder. So we can move that prepositional phrase to the end of the sentence so they start with the subject and it's easier for them to follow along with that sentence, like so. Oops, excuse me. Another example, and this was actually a math teacher who had given me the suggestion. He came up to me after one of my talks and he said that he was dyslexic, and for him, he found it really useful to present number problems and maths problems vertically, so straight down, rather than horizontally, straight across. And again, you can see the value of that. If they're carrying over numbers, they don't lose their place. And again, you're minimizing that processing, that effort that they have to use with respect to working memory. Another teacher gave me this tip about the history timeline. They said they found it really useful to present information, again, vertically when they're looking at a timeline, so you read straight down rather than straight across when you're looking at going in a historical timeline. So some of these tips here are simple tips that we can integrate in the classroom to minimize the effort of that working memory effort and space that we're requiring our students to use when it comes to activity. And the whole goal here with these strategies is to provide a kind of scaffold or support so they're able to keep up with the rest of the class. Now, another way in which we can look at improving working memory, and this is, I want to show you a picture of Jasmine. Now, Jasmine, at the time of this photo, was, I believe, 11 years old. And Jasmine was tested by the educational psychologist, and when she was tested, her working memory was in the bottom 10 percentile of age. You can see, I've put here these two apples to indicate that her working memory actually looked like an average 5-year-old. So she, when it came to working memory, was not doing certainly as well as she could. Now, in my own research, I found that students who have poor working memory, it's not a developmental lag, so it's not something that they grow out of. So if left to their own devices, they're not going to catch up on their own. We need to be able to intervene as educators, either via giving them strategies or providing some kind of intervention to support their learning and helping them keep up. Now, I put a link here, and this was actually done, this interview here, and I'm happy to pass it on to Erin so that if you wanted, you can. Video done by one of the TV companies where they went down to interview Jasmine and her mom. And for me, every time I watch that, it never fails just to, it's so incredible for me to hear, because it's Jasmine telling the story of how she felt she was really struggling in the classroom, really having a hard time, but after her training and after her intervention, it was remarkable when the educational psychologist tested her again. Her working memory was in average levels. Her IQs were in the top 10 percentile for her age. So she made huge improvements just after 8 weeks of training. And her mom here had gone ahead and sent me this photo of Jasmine and said I could share it. And she said Jasmine had never won anything in her school before, but after the training she was so pleased she actually won a memory award, and she was just so thrilled to be able to share her progress with us. And so this is Jasmine's story, and this was using a training program that I've had a chance to work with, and I'm going to share some of the data from that in a little bit. But when it comes to training working memory, there have been now a growing number of research looking at different programs, looking at different effects, looking at different results, and it's always important to ask ourselves some questions about what we're coming across. And for me, as a researcher, as a psychologist, these are the three questions that are important. These are the questions that I ask myself as a researcher. The first is transfer. If you do see improvements, will those improvements transfer to another task? So let's say you are, let's think of physical activity. Let's say you're training for a marathon and you decide as part of your training you want to do some weights and you're doing some leg curls or some leg-based exercises. Your legs feel stronger, you're able to lift stronger or heavier weights rather as part of your weights activities. Now the question is, will that transfer till you're running? Will you be able to run faster? And that's what transfer effects are referring to here. Will you improve not just in the program itself, but will they transfer to other tasks? So that's the first question that I look at in my own research. The second question is there a control group that is engaged in an activity? So in other words, you don't want to just have one group doing the training program. You want to be able to compare the progress with the control group that's hopefully doing something. So that's the second concern or second issue that I ask myself in my research as well. The maintenance effects here, the third question that I look at and have examined in my own research, and as I said, I'll talk about this data in the next few slides, is how long these improvements last. So in other words, let's think of physical activity again. If you're doing training, weight training, you may feel really strong when you're doing that training, but what happens when you stop? Will you still maintain that same level of strength that you had worked up to? So these are the three questions that I like to look at in my own research, and I'd like to talk about a couple different published studies where I've addressed this question. So the first here was looking at two groups of students, both of whom had learning needs, so they were identified, they received IEPs, and they did that a few times a week period. That was the first group here. So that was my active control doing something. The other group here were training using a program that I've been involved with called Jungle Memory, and they trained using a program also a few times a week over an 8-week period. So we have our two groups here. Then what I looked at the end of the 8-week period is I looked at, of course, their working memory scores, but I also wanted to know the transfer effect that we talked about a moment ago. Would it transfer to IQ? And crucially, would it transfer to learning outcomes like their language scores and their math? So I tested both of these groups before the 8-week period, before they began as a baseline, and then again at the 8-week period. Now what I found was this group here, my active control, stayed either the same or had a slight drop in some of the standardized assessments. In contrast, the working memory group improved significantly on their working memory scores, but most excitingly for me was that there was this transfer effect. So their IQ scores improved, as did their learning outcomes as well. In fact, the improvement was as high as 10 standard points. So that's like going from a C to a B or a B to an A for some of these students after just 8 weeks of training. So the first piece of research here including an active control and finding transfer effects. The other study that I was looking at here, which also involved Dyslexia Scotland, some of you may be familiar with them. Now here we had 3 groups, so I'll just take a moment. This was my control group here in these blue or grayish blue bars where they were a non-active control. They just carried on as usual. And these sort of orange bars, they did the training program, but just once a week. And here they did the program 4 times a week right there. So that's what you can see. Now what I represented here is the change or the difference in their standard scores at the start, before they began, and a week or so at the end of completing the 8-week period. So you can see that the group who trained regularly, who trained about 4 times a week, made significant gains in their working memory, transferred to IQ, and some smaller gains in their learning outcomes as well. When I tested them 8 months later to look at their maintenance that we talked about a bit earlier, all of those same gains were still maintained. So even though they had completed the training, they did not continue the training after 8 weeks. When I tested them 8 months later, they still showed all those same gains and improvements in performance. So we're seeing that they were able to perform well, that transferred to other activities, and that was maintained as well. So I'll have a little summary here. I'm just slightly over a 1 hour time, and I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions. Working memory is our ability to work with information. So in that sense, it's very crucial. There are 3 I's that I talked about today. That is, it is important for education. It is indifferent to a number of things like our financial background and our preference in our learning styles. We can still be successful with good working memory. And it is improvable. Now, I didn't spend time at all talking about exercise and diet, but I do have a new book out with HarperCollins, called The New IQ, that gives great tips, that talks about this in much more detail, and you're welcome to investigate that further. I believe you can get that on Amazon, and that covers working memory in the classroom. It talks about tips you can do at home. It talks in a little bit of detail about working memory and reading as well. And again, crucially, it talks about these simple tweaks you can do in everyday life that we didn't get a chance to talk about today. We spent mostly time with strategies and training from a classroom perspective. So I'll just end off there. Here are some of the resources that I mentioned. This book here is for adults, and I mentioned my website, TraceyAlloway.com, where you can get links to the abstracts of the publications that I talked about. So I'll stop here and leave some time for questions. And
I'm back on now.
I think, do I pass it on to Aaron?
Now, can you hear me okay? Right, you should be able to hear. Can you hear me okay, Tracey?
Yes.
That's fine. And I've put Katrina on as well. So yeah, we have got some questions come in. So what I'm going to do is, I found out now, this is the every time we use this this webinar piece of software, it does do something more. So I am going to just transfer myself back to me and just go to that page so we can see what's going on. I transferred it to the wrong. No, I transferred it to the wrong person. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, it is transferred it to that person there. Yes, make that. So show my screen. Yes, and you should be able to see when I started off. Yes. So there we go. That was the YouTube video. There we go. That's where we are now. So right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send some of the questions over to Tracey. So Tracey, if you want to have a look on your control panel, you should be able to see that's the first one. It's from Helen. Is that come up, Tracey?
Yes, I see Helen's question. It says, would you like me to read that out loud?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Because being dyslexic myself, it would be a lot easier for you to read it out.
Oh, absolutely. And I imagine that maybe some of the other delegates aren't able to see the question, so I'm certainly happy to do that. Helen's question was, in your view, can working memory be improved? And would you recommend any programs to improve working memory? Hopefully some of my slides answer that question, Helen. I should also mention the book I talked about, The New IQ, also has a whole chapter looking at evidence on computer games, simple games like Tetris and so on, to more strategy-based games, and looking at the evidence there for whether or not working memory can be improved. The bottom line is that you can see some cognitive benefits that are specific to the game. So you can your processing speed can improve depending if that's what the game focuses on, or your mental rotation improves with games like